Section 5.3, Proportions. A proportion is a statement that says that two ratios, or fractions, are equal to each other. In order to write a proportion, you just need to have an equal sign between the two ratios. So let's say that we have the two different ratios. One of the ratios is 1:2, and the other one is the ratio 3:6. So if I have it as a proportion, I would say 1:2 as 3:6. And I could write this as a fraction also. 1/2 equals 3/6. And we know that 1/2 equals 3/6, so we know that we do have a proportion. We have two different ratios that are equal to each other. Now, we know that, as I say, 1/2 is equal to 3/6, because if I have 1/2, I could multiply by the same numerator and denominator, and I would get 3/6. Another way to check whether or not two ratios form a proportion, to see if you actually have a proportion, is to cross multiply. If I have 1/2 equal to 3/6, you could go through and you could figure out what are the products when you cross. 1 times 6 gives me 6. 2 times 3 gives me 6. So I know that 1/2 is equal to 3/6. So the ratios 1/2, 1:2, and 3/6, 3:6, do form a proportion because they are equal to each other. Let's check this one. Do the ratios 3/4 and 7/10 form a proportion? To do that and to find out, I'm going to set those two equal to each other. I'm going to put a question mark in between. In order to find out, I'm going to cross multiply. 3 times 10 gives me 30. 4 times 7 gives me 28. So the ratio 3:4 as 7:10 is not a proportion because those are not equal when I cross multiply them. Here's another one. How about if I have 3:1/2 as 30:5? Is that a proportion? I could go through once again and cross multiply. 3 times 5 gives me 15. 1/2 times 30 gives me 15. So yes, 3:1/2 as 30:5 is also a proportion. When writing a proportion, it is important to have the same units in the same part of the fraction. So let's write this as a proportion. If it takes 3 hours to mow 4 acres of grass, it will take 6 hours to mow 8 acres of grass. So if I wanted to write that as a proportion, I could write 3 hours over 4 acres is equal to 6 hours over 8 acres. And does that form a proportion? Well, it does, because 3 times 8 gives me 24, and 4 times 6 gives me 24. So I know that is a proportion. But what I want to make sure of is, notice that I have hours for both of those ratios in the numerator, and I have acres for both of those in the denominator. Just make sure that when you are writing the separate ratios, that you keep the hours in the same part of the fraction and the acres in the same part of the fraction, the way that I have them here. So in this section, you will be given something that looks like it is a proportion, but you will be asked to prove that it is a proportion. So here I have 7 cups of flour for 4 loaves of bread. Is that the same as 4 cups of flour for 3 loaves of bread? In order to prove that, all I'm going to do is rewrite this without all the words. Is 7 over 4 equal to 4 over 3? In order to find out, I'm going to cross multiply. 7 times 3 gives me 21. 4 times 4 gives me 16. So this is not a proportion because the two ratios are not equal to each other. Finally, the last thing you will need to be able to do in this section is to write a proportion given a situation. So here's the situation. If Maria hits 8 home runs in 15 games, then she should hit 24 home runs in 45 games. If I wanted to write a proportion, I am just going to write it the way I have it. 8 home runs in 15 games, and notice I have home runs on the top and games on the bottom, is equal to 24 home runs in 45 games. And once again, notice that in both cases, I have home runs for the numerator and games for the denominator. It is important that you do that. These are equal to each other. It is a proportion. 8 times 45, if I were to go through and multiply 8 times 45, I would get the same product as 15 times 24. And I will leave that to you to do the math just to make sure. As you can see, this is a rather short section, but is very important to the work we will do in the next section. Please let me know if you have any questions.